Hi there, and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. This is a web series that explores and explains 20 years of Magic's history. This week we're looking at Legions, the second set of Onslaught block, and the first ever set to consist of only one card type. That's right, Legions is the creature set. Every single card is a creature. No instants, no sorceries, no enchantments, no lands. There aren't even any artifacts. Every single card in the set has power and toughness. No other set has tried this before. The closest thing we have to a set where every single card shares one major characteristic is New Alara, which is entirely composed of gold cards, but that's it. Released in 2003, Legions continues the story of Onslaught. So after the death of Ixidor, Akroma, the Angel of Wrath, has no master, and uses her power of charisma to enslave most of Otaria's armies. Kamal, his druids and centaurs, as well as the zombies and minions of the Cabal, team up to take her down. In the big throwdown at the end, Phage the Untouchable and Akroma face off. Phage makes contact with Akroma, and unlike everything else that Phage has touched, Akroma doesn't die. Instead, the two fuse, along with an expositional witch, and become Corona, the false god. Now, I know there are ebooks out there for this block, and to be blunt, I don't recommend them. Or the storyline for this entire block. Or Odyssey block, except for the Torment book, which was pretty good. Mechanics. As the second set in the Onslaught block, Legions continues the earlier mechanics of the block. There are more morphs and more cycling cards. This set also introduced Double Strike, although it only appears on 2 cards. These days, Double Strike is an evergreen keyword, though it doesn't show up all that often. There were also 2 brand new keywords, Amplify and Provoke. All the major factions are still here, so because this is still part of the tribal block, let's do a quick profile of the best limited common in each tribe. For an overview of each tribe, please check out my Onslaught review. Birds, well, this one's a tough one. There are a lot of 2-power flyers for 4 mana, which is par for the course for a decent limited common, and there's only one that has 2 power for 3. But the one that gets the nod from me is Aven Redeemer, whose 2-power damage prevention ability can dominate creature combat in the mid to late game. This card isn't great on offense, but it can definitely get you to a position where you can take over the board and win. The call on soldiers, this one isn't hard. Daru's Stinger is actually a really awesome card beyond what the printed text says. See, a few years after Legions got printed, Wizards decided to go and give as many cards as they could a race type as well as a job type. Many bland elves became warriors or shamans. Many cephalids became soldiers or wizards. Well, this guy became human. Sorry, Pinocchio, you don't get to be human because you weren't printed before the grand creature type revision. You're just going to stay a construct for the rest of your days. But I digress. Daru's Stinger now gets +1/+1 counters for each soldier or human you reveal from your hand when you play it. And since there are so many humans now, that's awesome. But at the time, it really didn't matter. Even before the Grand Creature type update, which occurred during Mirrodin block if I recall correctly, Daru's Stinger was still the best soldier in the set. But with that upgrade, when we look at constructed formats, it's almost as good as Timberwatch Elf, which is to say, it's really good. For the clerics, Vile Deacon gets the nod over Whipgrass Entangler, who has a really powerful effect in the late game, but in the early game, you're not going to be able to pay the steep cost to keep things out of combat. Both of these cards are really good, but Deacon is the best on the attack, and that's why I think it's the best cleric. Covert Operative is unblockable and has 3 power. So long as you can stabilize the game, there's a win condition. These days, Wizards isn't too excited about unblockability, and there is some rumor going around that the evergreen status of things like Intimidate and Landwalk may not happen. I'm going to say that unblockability is still not as preferred as Landwalk. Now, as far as Wizards go, yeah, Covert Operative is probably the best pick. Another close runner-up is Echo Tracer, the set's equivalent of Unsummon. You get to play for 3 and then activate for 3, which is easy to do on tempo, but the cost really adds up. So that's why I'm giving the nod to Covert Operative. Skin Thinner is going to be the leader of the zombies in commons. Skin Thinner doesn't have any real special synergies, but the ability to turn over and Dark Banish something, yeah. This cost is well worth it in Limited. Skirk Marauders is the best common goblin. Now, if you're running a deck that goes long, then Flamewood Invoker is going to be better, because he gets to throw Lava Axes. But Skirk Marauders is guaranteed to shock something, whereas Onslaught Skirk Commando only dealt damage if it connected. I'm going to take the sure thing against potential repeatability. Also, the Marauders can kill both Sparksmith and the Timberwatch Elf, so this is a really amazing card. Crows and Vorine, yeah, this is the king of the beasts. This sneaky hunter could pin down and kill any small creature your opponent controlled. If they have power 1 or less, the Vorine would live again to hunt another day. It comboed spectacularly well with the best elf. Now, I also really like Crested Craghoof, a 4/1 hasty provoker. This was a really stealthy form of removal, like Perforos's Rage and Theros, although sometimes the Craghoof could swing in for damage once when the board is clear, and then you get to take out the blocker later on. For the elves, we need to do a quick recap of pumping history. Unlike Arabian's Wily Wolf, which could only pump for +1/+1, or Honesty's Nantico Disciple, which could pump for +2/+2, but required a significant cost up front, and G whenever you wanted to use it, the Timberwatch Elf gave a pump for free, which often turned into +4/+4 in the late game. This card was almost as abusive and limited as Sparksmith. This is the common that warped the format. Oh, and this set rolls out a new tribe to the block. Guess who's back? The Slivers. This set has 15 of them with a common, uncommon, and rare cycle. The common ones are pretty lousy, though. Okay, now that we've covered the basics, let's open the pack and see what we get.
Okay, next up for our show today, we've got Legions. Yeah, the all-creature set. So let's see what we get out of here. And what's going to be our first pick? All right. So we open up, and let's see. Berserk Myrmidont, which can be... It's kind of a weird rampage. Crows and Morine. Wow, this card was actually really strong. Really, really strong. Especially against 1-drops. Things with 1 power, this guy would eat them. Covert Operative is okay. Defiant Elf is lousy. Embalmed Brawler, meh. Yeah, that Amplify is a little bit risky, but hey, sometimes you just want a 2/2 body for 3. You don't have to amplify it. Daru's Stinger was actually quite strong. You know, you got some range strike here if you got enough soldiers. Don't forget, you can use Amplify multiple times. Just show as many cards as you want. We got a Misformed Sliver, which allows you to hack your slivers into other creature types. That's pretty cool in this set. Needleshot Gorna, pretty big 6-drop. Flamewake Invoker, if the game gets stalled, this guy just rips your opponent a new one. Wall of Hope, okay, cheap defensive card. Vile Deacon, only good for clerics, and yes, it has that ability where it also counts clerics your opponents have. Rich Top Raptor, 2/1 Double Strike. Yeah, Double Strike guy a little more expensive than they're costed today, but they were playing with it. Wall of Deceit. Yep, so this actually was a pretty good morph on defense. We got here Gem Palm Strider. Nice little cycling card. It can give your elves a little rampage. And for our rare, we got Goblin Goon. 6/6 Goblin for 4 mana. Roar, huge. However, there's lots of times you're not going to be able to attack or block with them. Pretty good pack.
Cards of note. Akroma, Angel of Wrath. Look at that text box. She only has 1 line of flavor text, which is one of the most well-known in Magic's history. The rest of the card, wow, look at all those keywords. Flying, Trample, First Strike, Haste, Protection from Black, Protection from Red, and the awkward original wording of Vigilance. Akroma is a mighty fine reanimation target, and she's particularly unusual in having Haste, a keyword that is distinctly on white. But she is an avatar of Divine Wrath, and why should God's Wrath have to wait? Deathblade Elite doesn't untap, unlike the Gust Cloak guys from Onslaught, but he gets to draw the blocker that would block something better, like one of your flyers, and it lives to tell the tale. In Creature Slugfests, this is worth something. Legion's famous reprint is White Knight. With First Strike and Protection from Black, this guy was perfectly respectable in Limited. Sometimes, cards make you overthink things. Wingbeat Warrior is definitely a trap. In the vast majority of games, you're just going to want to run it out there on turn 3 and attack unimpeded. But in the late game, giving a creature first strike is well worth the mana, generally speaking. But the fast way was usually best, because yes, you're going to be able to save a creature in the middle of combat with first strike, but you're also denying yourself the evasion beats if you keep this morphed. Windborn Muse is my favorite propaganda-type card. Now, keep in mind that I don't like propaganda-type effects, and I've said that every single time I talk about one. So why do I call this one my favorite one? Because since it's a creature, I can kill it! I get great joy in ending propaganda outlets. This is why I feel like Windborn Muse is such a great cube card. This can put its controller way ahead in the race, and it can get some evasive damage in. But there are answers to it. Chromeshell Crab is a very interesting spin on Gilded Drake. Like the famous Urza Saga flyer, it allows you to exchange creatures with an opponent. Unlike the Gilded Drake, you can swap any creature, even a 0/1 plant token, with their best guy. But the morph activation cost is way more. Dreamborn Muse is the perfect creature for players who want to run mill without spending mana on it. Every player mills on their upkeep equal to the number of cards in their hand. This is especially unpleasant for control decks who usually like to keep their mitts full. It's a perfect card for EDH decks that have mill components without necessarily going all in on mill, like Mimeoplasm. It's a known bound effect, and while it is significant, it's not going to wipe anyone out all at once. I talked about him before, but if you're looking for cheap, good morphs for your Pauper Cube, Echo Tracer is a good choice. This creature can bounce another creature at any time. This is different from Mana War, who can only do the bounce bit when it hits play, but you're doomed to pay a lot for this. Onslaught block was not a very speedy affair, so it was okay. Instead of paying mana to become any creature type, Mistform Ultimus just is every creature type, at once. It's also a legend. Years later, this ability became grafted onto commons with Changeling, but Mistform Ultimus was out there as a pioneer, blazing the trail. Yes, we need teenagers. We need teenagers to be printed in Magic so we can have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Riptide Mangler has a surprisingly effective activated ability, particularly in multiplayer games. For just 2 mana, you get to tack on any other creature's power onto this guy. There's nothing you can do about the toughness, though. This isn't going to break the game, but it is still a fun card. In Commander, there are some morphs that still see play. My Prime Speaker Zagana deck runs 2 from Legions. One of these is Willbender, which can redirect a spell's target when he unmorphs. This is also very hard to counter. This is fun. If you like Skin Thinner, here's a slightly cheaper alternative. A Fellow Exterminator only gives creatures -3/-3 until end of turn, a last breath, but it's 1 mana cheaper to flip over. This was a solid black uncommon and a very fine first pick. Bane of the Living. Now, here is a scary morph. The previous black creature that could wipe the board, Thrashing Wumpus, was a known quantity when it hit the table. Bane of the Living was able to wipe the board with everyone with enough mana, though most players were happy to flip it as an Infest effect and keep their Bane on the board. And opponents couldn't know for certain that it was Bane. Despite the double black activation cost, Bane was better in decks with multiple colors, so opponents had to keep guessing what that morph was. The set also had another creature that could wipe the board, Havoc Demon. This 5/5 flyer is only slightly undercosted by current standards. Sadly, the demon never got much play in Standard due to the high casting cost, but it may find a home in your casual cubes or theme decks. Crypt Sliver is just a fancy, team-up-y version of Drudge Skeletons. I really like this card in Limited because there was no mana cost for the regeneration. We have to talk about Dark Supplicant and its partner in crime, Scion in Darkness, together. So, like today's Shadowborn Apostle and Shadowborn Demon, the Dark Supplicant and 2 other clerics of any type could summon forth a nasty, giant beast. The Scion of Darkness didn't fly and didn't destroy a creature when it hit play, but any creature it dealt combat damage to that died came over to your side. This ability is incredibly flavorful and quite terrifying. The nice thing about the Supplicant is that it could get the Scion out of your graveyard. This gave players a little more incentive to cycle the Scion away. Gempalm Polluter sounds less like a zombie and more like a rejected Captain Planet villain. It was a powerful finisher for zombie decks. Playing it instead of cycling is underwhelming, but when you're in a top deck war, sometimes it's exactly what the doctor ordered. No. I am not going to do a joke about Heart. Just because a guy makes a Captain Planet joke doesn't mean he has to make a joke about Mati and his ridiculous power. Forget it. It ain't happening. I have standards. Admittedly low standards, but not low enough to make a Heart joke. You want to see a black card? Phage the Untouchable is one of the most dangerous creatures in existence. If she damages an opponent in combat, that player packs it up. Even at infinite life, they're still dead. She has a weird Death Touch variant for creatures as well, but she disapproves of brokenness. How does Phage disapprove? If she hits play without coming directly from her controller's hand, she turns on her controller and puts them out of their misery. Withered Wretch was a tournament staple and the first one to regularly deal with cards in the graveyard while filling out another role effectively. Wretch was a powerful answer to Odyssey's control decks that ran flashback cards. Withered Wretch was such a hit that it got a callback in Time Spiral thanks to the time-shifted sheets, as did Achroma, and Willbender, and Essence Sliver. Really? Legions probably had a lot of fans in Time Spiral's design team. Click Slither. This card has a really annoying name in a set that has slivers in it because it's not a sliver, it's a slither. Neither is it a goblin, but it gets bigger by eating goblins. This card was a surprisingly powerful finisher in constructed goblin decks. Gem Palm Incinerator. This card filled a very important role in goblin decks as a prime removal spell in the mid-game. Sometimes your curve insisted that you play this guy onto the table on turn 2, and lots of times that is the right call. This card was a huge assist for goblin decks and led to their dominance in Standard during Odyssey Onslaught block. Goblin Assassin. This card usually spent times in sideboards in case the opponent was running control, in which case the assassin was a drag on your card advantage. But against beast decks or cards that played big fatties, this was a fine addition from the sideboard. Goblin Clearcutter. If you want to ramp once or twice to 7 or 8 mana, this Orcish Lumberjack variant is exactly what you need. Wizards is rather leery of this ability, turning lands into super rituals. It's pretty risky. Goblin Dynamo. This card calls for music from Street Fighter that isn't Giles. Shaku Hadouken! Seriously, this is the set's alternative to an X-Spell, and it works. Johnnies love Goblin Goon because this card rewards board management. Timmies love the idea of a 6/6 for 4 mana. This combination is pretty fun. Now, 6/6 sounds huge today, but in 2003 standards, it was even more huge by comparison. Remember, M14 had a common 4/4 for 4 mana with no drawbacks. Here we've got a 6/6. Now, this is definitely a memorable card. Kilnmouth Dragon, unlike most dragons, loves company, which is why he has Amplify 3. This dragon's appeal lied in the potential for it to be the biggest dragon ever. This was a Timmy Johnny card if ever there was one. Warbreak Trumpeteer. This is the only goblin token producer in the block, which seems actually crazy to the modern eye. Goblins normally have lots of ways to produce tokens like Krenko or Krenko's Command or Mog War Marshal, but Onslaught really wasn't much of a token block. Alright, I talked about tokens. Well, Collar of the Claw is green's answer to Wrath effects. This elf was the first stab at finding a way to actually beat mass removal in mono green. While Collar of the Claw will not actually save any of your Doom creatures, it can be flashed in and brings a bear for each of your creatures that died. Well, except for tokens, that would make it stupidly good in EDH if it did make bears for dead tokens, but anyway. Feral Throwback. Here's a design quandary. This was the pre-release card, and honestly, it's one of the worst of all time. At least Questing Feldergriff had flavor. Now, the Throwback's Amplify flavor was kind of cool, and it also had Provoke, so players could sit down at this new set and learn what the big new mechanics of the set were when they sat down at the pre-release. In terms of a teaching tool, this was a wise selection to put in the hands of newer players. But this card was too expensive to ever be worth playing. See, this is the way to make an Amplify creature. Canopy Crawler comes out for 4 mana, and while it gets far less +1/+1 counters for each beast revealed, it comes out at a time when your hand is filled with several beasts. This actually gives you some board presence in the mid-game. The ability to pump any other creature is okay, but you're better off attacking with it most of the time. This is also a hell of a blocker. Gem Palm Strider is the most expensive cycling card of the set, giving all your elves a mini overrun effect. That's quite strong, and it was an essential closer in elf decks. Its status as most expensive card to cycle got eclipsed with Scourge, however. Hundrug. This was the joke card of the set. Much like Chimney Imp, players just like to write jokes about Hundrug. Now, Hundrug has cycling, but 4/7 for 7 mana is just overcosted. Yeah, it can take a Crawworm in the fight, but it was a lousy attacker. The internet being what it is, they make a ton of jokes at this card's expense in 2003 that felt a lot like Chuck Norris jokes. No, I don't want to make any Chuck Norris jokes either. Croson Cloudscraper. This is Magic's first 13/13. The upkeep cost wasn't so bad either, but the Cloudscraper didn't have trample. For many years, this was the card with the highest power and toughness in Magic. Ravnica's Autochthonic Worm was the first creature to surpass its toughness. The only creatures that trump its power are Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, and the Marit Lage token produced by Dark Depths. And X creatures because they're variable. But still, if you like really big guys, this is the really big guy. Seedborn Muse. Holy crap. Now this is a powerful creature. Untapping all your permanents every upkeep, this was a perfect fit in blue-green decks, playing creatures and then having counter magic ready on their turn. It gets even more ridiculous in group games when you have a mana sink, building resources at the end of every turn. This has been a staple of EDH since the format's creation. Wirewood Channeler, with one other elf out, and this guy equipped with Onslaught's Pemin's Aura, you could make infinite mana. What you do with that is up to you. Let's take a quick break for The Price is Right. Final verdict! Let's start off by looking at Legion's mechanics. Provoke was a cool ability that allowed creatures to double as removal spells. Giving creatures the direct ability to fight each other was cool. Now, I must confess, I'm not particularly familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh!, but as I understand it, that game features creatures directly fighting each other instead of hitting the opponent's life score. And I know that's the case with Duel Monsters and Kaiju-Do, two games I actually do understand. I don't play them, but I've read the rules and I think I have a very good understanding of them. So is this a sop to players from those games? I doubt it. Provoke is the removal ability of Legions. Provoke gave attackers advantage in dealing with tricky combat scenarios and allowed land-bound players to deal with flyers. It also happened fast enough to deal with annoying utility creatures like Timberwatch Elf and Sparksmith the turn they came into play, before they could tap themselves to avoid engaging in combat. After the cat was out of the bag, okay, Provoke's utility diminished. Now, I have very fond memories of Provoke in Limited. It rarely came up in Standard, though. Mark Rosewater has said with the evergreen status of Fight solving a lot of problems for green and occasionally red, Provoke is unlikely to make a comeback, and I'm okay with that. But the stepping stone to modern technology was still fun to play with, and we should acknowledge it. Amplify had a serious problem in that many of its creatures that had it were among the most expensive in their tribe. In order to maximize the potential for this ability, players had to hold back on developing their board until the end game. This required either a heavy commitment to ramp, so you could get the mana to play that Amplify guy, or lots of mass removal, which in effect kept Amplify from really hitting high strides. Now, this was a neat idea in theory, but Amplify would have been much better if creatures with this ability were cheaper. Wizards played it too safe with this mechanic. Double Strike may have been printed in the set for the first time, but it came up so infrequently that many players didn't have to pay heed to it. It wasn't a factor in Limited, and it wasn't a factor in Constructed. I have no idea if Wizards thought that this would be an evergreen keyword when they made it. They certainly didn't print enough cards for most players to engage with Double Strike, sticking their toe into the water with only 2 cards. Scourge followed up with Double Strike on only 1 card, though that card was admittedly awesome, and nigh unplayable. I don't want to rag on Double Strike because later sets have shown that it has some serious juice and fun to it, but it started off with a whimper, not a roar. I commend Legion's major shift in Morph, causing spell-like effects to happen when the creature transformed, not just by dealing damage, and this led to some really enjoyable gameplay. This was an effective way of shaking up the environment. Let's look at the tribal elements. The extension of tribal themes in Onslaught clicked with players, and Amplify was a great way to signal players to care about creature types when drafting. Now, Legions doesn't have as many cards that boost members of all tribes, but its more efficient mana costs and shift towards higher power and toughness made for a fresh, limited format. You were generally getting slightly better deals even if you were paying a lot for it. There are some casual hooks in the set, and a few powerhouses that are still used in casual formats today. Akroma is still one of the most awesome creatures of all time. Most of the set's hits have seen reprints, however. Let's talk about the downsides, though. The slivers come out of nowhere and get little support in Onslaught and virtually no support in Scourge. There's only 1 sliver in Scourge, and it's awesome, but 1 guy alone doesn't count. New slivers were a nice tidbit for extended players who loved slivers, but for standard players, the new tribe was a cruel joke. The support to make slivers playable just wasn't there. Legions was a dividing set. To quote the song from the hit musical Gypsy, you gotta have a gimmick. And the gimmick of Legions turned off quite a few players. Devoted control players who clung to their counterspells in Wrath of Gods wanted nothing to do with a set with no instants or sorceries. There was literally nothing for them there. There were no artifacts or enchantments. There weren't any cool lands in the set. Creatures may be the #1 most popular card type in Magic, sure. After you exclude basic lands, creatures are easily the most frequent card type players use. This has always been the case, barring 94 and 95 when the basic theory of the game was evolving. Creatures had a cachet that stands out. Mark Rosewater has said in his Drive to Work podcast that if Magic had a card type or more removed, the last card type to be removed would be creature. Now, I personally prefer Planeswalkers more because they're the closest to an equal to the player that exists in Magic. But I understand that creatures are the heart of the game, more or less. Heart. If you want to get something done in the game, most of the time you want creatures. Creatures can simulate any effect in Magic as Legions shows us, and this set highlights creatures at the expense of all others. There is a tonal dissonance to this set. See, when we talk about the flavor of the game of Magic, there are creatures that you summon, planeswalkers you ally with, artifacts and enchantments you create and wield, and then there are the direct actions that you, the planeswalker, engage in. Those direct actions are instants and sorceries. The player is the one that throws lightning bolts, or shoots fear into the heart of an angel with terror. This creates a sense of agency. Lots of card games and board games have commanders calling the shots, sending tanks or battleship into action. Magic has that too with the red zone, but it also lets the player's avatar get into the thick of things. That agency is what makes the game fantastic. And by taking this agency away from the player and putting it into the hands of the troops, this set feels more tactical and board game-like, taking away some of the fantasy flavor. All you're doing is calling up guys and having them put in a day's work. Now, I'm okay with this tonal shift because it only lasted for 1 set. Maybe I'm okay with a more wargame like Magic because it only lasted for such a short time. If it was for a whole block, I don't think that would fly. That's why I can say that Legions is also one of the most innovative sets of all time. So let's give Legions a score. This score is going to be subjective, as are all my scores, but this time I really mean it. If you start off with Alpha or so and learn that games turn on spells, not creatures, as was the case with early Magic, then Legions is going to be a giant turnoff. If you came outside that window and enjoyed creature combat above all else, then Legions is going to be a fantastic set. I'm going to split the difference and rate the set a 6 out of 10 good. Take my comments to heart and decide for yourself whether you want to try this set out or not. That's it for this week of Ancestral Recall. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please remember to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. If you're new to the series, go back and check out some of my older videos. I'm sure there's more you'll love. Next week, we're finishing up Onslaught block with Scourge, an extremely controversial set with a mechanic that changed the way we look at Magic forever. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games, and good luck.